This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So, if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial. This one is a follow-up to last week's logo animations episode 4, where we used After Effects and Element 3D to animate football clubs logos. And if you haven't seen that already, then do check it out. Lots of cool tips there. However, that tutorial has a bit of an entry barrier because both After Effects and Element need to be paid for. So today we're gonna be using Blender, which is an awesome and completely free 3D software, and that means that anyone can participate. On that note, let's take a look at the final result. This tutorial is aimed towards more intermediate users, so I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with the basics of Blender. Even so, I will try to explain the process in as much detail as possible. The project file is available for free on my Gumroad page along with all of my previous projects, and again, all you need for it to work is Blender. I'll also make sure to leave a link in the description to polyhaven.com, which offers free 3D assets, specifically a link to an HDRI image that we're gonna be using, so make sure you also grab that. Let me know in the comments section if you'd be interested in seeing more Blender tutorials, alongside After Effects tutorials, of course. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here we are now in Blender, and as you can see, I have the original project open. And we don't need to close this. In fact, we can create another scene inside of the same project, kind of like we would do in After Effects with multiple compositions. If we go up here, we can see this button that's sort of like a duplicate document. If we click on that, we get 4 options, and we'll just click on New. And now we have a completely fresh scene. As for the layout, we can go over to the corner of one of these windows, and as soon as we get this plus symbol, we can click and drag to the left to merge those 2 windows. Do the same thing at the bottom. And then you can also do the same thing if you hover over the empty area here and just right click, close area. Then we'll drag the timeline down and we'll switch to timeline. Anyway, before we continue with the logo animation, let's go over to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, which are sort of like plugins in After Effects, we want to search for SVG and make sure that Import Export Scalable Vector Graphics add-on is enabled, and then also Images as Planes is also enabled. Now let's close that. Now we can click Shift A to add, then go down here, Image, Images as Planes. Then we'll locate our reference image, which is this BMW logo, and hit Import Images as Planes. And if we zoom in here, you can't really see it right now because we're in the viewport shading mode. But if we switch over to Material Preview mode and then click this arrow and just make sure Scene World is checked off, it's gonna use a default HDRI here just so that we can set things up. And then once we're ready, we can import our own HDRI. Now we'll import the logo. So we'll go over to File, Import, Scalable Vector Graphics is what we're looking for. Then select the logo and then hit Import SVG. And you can barely see them because they're very small. But over here on the Layers tab, we can select the first one, go down, hold down Shift and select the bottom one, which will select everything in between. Then hit S for scale and just scale it up as much as you want. Then we'll select the BMW reference image, drag it on the X like so. And if we look at the SVG logo, it's a complete mess. But that's fine because we're gonna clean things up, delete some things we don't need, and then start extruding them. So let's start by selecting this outer outline. And then in the Layers tab, we can double click on it and rename it to Outer Outline. And we'll hide it by hitting H, or you could even hit the I symbol right here. Then we'll continue hiding some other elements just so we can find whatever we don't need and delete them. So for example, the letters here have an extra layer of shadow, but we're gonna delete those by hitting X and hitting delete, then select the other one, hit X, hit delete, and do the same thing for the B letter. Then we'll select this outer base. We'll go over to the Layers tab, say outer base black, and we'll hide it. Then we'll select the letters, we'll do B, we'll do M and W. Now we can also select all the letters and just hit H. So from the prior work I've done with this logo specifically, I noticed that there are some outer edges here or outer objects that we don't need. So we just click here, you can see it outlines that object. We can delete that. Then we can continue selecting other objects until we land on those that we don't need. We'll hit X, 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 and X. And you can see there's this cross element, so we'll rename that to cross. We'll hide that. Then if we zoom out a bit, you can see these are the blue shapes. So we'll do blue bottom right and blue top left. We'll select the reference image that we had and we'll try to line it up with our logo and we'll turn everything back on. And then with the reference image selected, we'll hit S one more time and just scale it up. And you can see it's scaling up quite fast, but we can hold down Shift and that'll make it more sensitive. If we go back to these curves and select any of them, we can use this image as reference to determine what shapes we need. So this shape we can name to inner outline silver. This one we're gonna delete completely because it's basically the white areas, but it's a full circle. But seeing as we already have the blue parts, we can use those and just duplicate them. Select that, hit X, delete. Then as you can see, this is the inner outline black. And we don't need this one either because it's pretty much the same as the outer base black. It's just that in the 2D logo design, they did some 2D shading. So we'll select it, hit X, delete. We can go ahead and hide the reference image for now. Then we can orbit around the scene and we can see that everything is clipping, and that's fine. We'll fix that in a bit. Now we'll click on one of these symbols, which brings up the object data properties. Then click and drag to select all of them. And let's quickly go back to the Z view, which is the top view. And if we zoom in here, you can see these circles. They have these jagged lines because there's not much detail. And the way we can fix that is in the resolution preview. If we make some room here, you can see it says 12. Well, we want to increase that. If we hold down Alt and then click and drag, it's going to affect every single object. So now if we select any of these objects, you can see the resolution preview is set to 64 and we don't need to touch the render value because if it's set to 0, you can see it says 0 uses preview resolution. And then we'll go down and under the geometry tab, we can hold down Alt one more time to extrude all of them at once. And you can see it's very sensitive, so we can hold down Shift to go a bit slower. We could maybe select this and then bring it down a bit. Then we'll select the blue parts on the inside. So select one of them, hold down Control, select the other. Then we can hit G to bring up the Move tool or Grab tool, whatever you want to call it. And then hit Z to lock it on the Z axis as you're moving it. And in fact, we can hold down Control and select the letters as well, and then move them up on the Z axis. So now we'll select the cross, hit GZ to bring it up, and then we'll select this part and hit GZ to move it down a bit like so. Now, of course, we're not really able to see these pretty well, so we'll go back to viewport shading mode. And if we click this arrow, just make sure that the color is set to random, and this will assign a random color to each individual object, which makes it a lot easier to work with. All right, so they're looking pretty cool, but one thing I want to mention is that all of these objects have very sharp edges. And in real life, pretty much nothing has 100% sharp edges. So we'll select all of these, and back in the object data properties, if you go down to the bevel, if we even set this to 0.001, you can see they become like blobs. And in fact, I don't want that, so click and then type in 0.0005 and hit enter as you hold down Alt. And that just makes sure that the bevel is very tight. But if we zoom in here, you can see how much they add to the overall look. They just help catch the light. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is if we go over to the top view, by the way, you can use the gizmo up here, which I like to do most of the time, or you can hit the tilde key, which is right underneath the escape key. And that will bring up this pie menu. And you can see we have top view, back view, right view, left, whatever you want. And we can just go over to top view. And the thing I wanted to show you is, let's say select the B letter and we'll increase the bevel depth. You can see that it's extruding or expanding the overall shape of the letter, which is not good in cases where you need to stay true to the logo design, because this is actually changing the silhouette. One thing you can do to counteract that is to use the offset value up here. But I find that most of the time it just breaks the entire geometry. So you can see even if I go down a bit to offset it inwards, it's just creating weird artifacts. So that's just something you have to keep in mind. The next thing we need to do is set the origin of each of these objects to the center. The origin is pretty much the anchor point, as you would call it in After Effects. So we can select all of these, right click, set origin to geometry. So now if we select the W letter, that's the orange dot right at the center there. Same for the M, same for the cross. And this just means that whenever we want to rotate or scale an object, it's gonna scale and rotate from that point. By the way, you can hit R twice, so RR, to go into free rotation mode, and then right click to cancel the rotation. And before we start applying materials now, let's select one of these blue parts, and then you can select another one by holding down Control if you're on the Layers tab, or you can hold down Shift if you're in the Viewport, and that will add to the selection. And now we can hit Control J to join them into one object. Then right click again, set origin to geometry. And seeing as the origin is right there at the center, if we go over to the top view, we can Shift D to duplicate, then hit R, hit Z, and then we'll type in 9D on the keyboard, which rotates it by 90 degrees. And then we'll call these white inner parts, blue inner parts. For some reason, they just got the same color there. Whatever. Another thing we could do is select all of these objects one more time and then hold down Shift, select the outer outline, which makes it an active object. You can see this one is like a brighter orange compared to these darker oranges. And then hit Control P to parent all of those objects to the active object. And now if we select the outline, hit R to rotate, you can see they all rotate with it. And in fact, we'll hit Alt G to reset the position of this object, which brings it right at the center of the world. If we hit Control Z, you can do the same thing if we go to Object, Clear, Location. You can do the same thing for rotation, scale as well. Now, remember when I told you about the default HDRI that we can set here by unchecking the scene world? This means that it doesn't use the world HDRI that we have pre-set up in our project. And you can do that by going over to this world icon, then hitting new. And to see the changes here, we have to go back to the arrow, make sure it's using scene world. And if we change the default color here, you can see that it's affecting the logo and how it looks. But we want to use a custom image for this. So we'll click on this circle, then we'll go over to environment texture. And it's pink right now because we don't have anything selected. But we'll go over to Open, locate the HDRI, which I found from Polyhaven, as I mentioned at the beginning. Select it, hit Open Image, and now we're going to be able to see that HDRI on our scene. But I don't want to see this on the final render, so let's go over to the Render Properties. First, let's switch to the Cycles engine. By the way, this is the Ray Trace engine. Then we'll make sure that we set this to GPU compute, so it uses our GPU. And we'll set the max samples on our viewport to something like 256. And we'll scroll down until we find Film, and just make sure you check the Transparent option. And then over here, because we are in the material preview, nothing is happening, but we need to switch to the render mode in order to see those changes. So without the transparent box checked, we can see the HDRI. With it checked, we don't see it. Now we can go over to the corner until we get that plus symbol one more time. Click and drag to split the view. And if we merge these one more time, you can actually right click here, go over to vertical split, and just split this view wherever you want. It's the same thing, but two different ways of doing it. And on the left side, I like to hide all the gizmos here and just leave it on render mode so we can see how it's gonna look in the final render. Whereas on the right side, we're gonna leave it on viewport shading mode with random colors. But keep in mind, this is all personal preference. Now we'll also split this in half. And if we go over to this button right here, we can switch to the shader editor, which is where we take care of all the materials on our scene. To hide this box at the side here, we can hit N while the mouse cursor is hovering over this window. And now if I select one of these objects and click on this button to assign whatever material I want, you can see these ones at the top are the ones I used in the original scene. And then these ones at the bottom are the ones that were created when I imported the SVG file. So back in the top view on the render here, we'll bring back the reference image. We'll just use it as a reference to know exactly what color we need to assign to what object. For the outer outline, you can see we have this sort of silver look. So we'll go over here. Let's just select one of these pre-existing materials that were imported. And we'll rename this to silver. Now, of course, we don't see anything here, and that's because we have to use nodes. And now if we zoom in, we have this principled shader, which uses real-world calculations to determine how this material is gonna look. And I'm not gonna go into too much detail with all of the values. If you're interested in that, there's plenty of tutorials out there that cover the principled shader and that go into detail explaining all of these values. For now, let's set the metallic to 1. Then over on the roughness, which controls sort of like the reflectivity of the object. So if it's 100% rough, then it's gonna have a matte finish. Whereas if it's 0%, it's pretty much a mirror. We'll set that to 0.3. And over on the clear coat, we'll increase that to 1. And you may be thinking, oh my God, he's a genius. How does he know how to do this? Well, I just wrote them down on a notepad. And to prove that, I'll copy and paste a color code here on the side monitor. Go over to the base color, make sure you're in the hex code, and just select this and hit Ctrl V to paste. Now we can drop this down and make sure we're selecting the outer base black, which is this part. And now we can click here and apply a different material. So we'll do SVG matte, whatever, and we'll do black. Use nodes. We'll set the color to completely black because I checked. This logo has a pure black value over here. Now it may seem like this is not pure black, and that's because if we select the reference image, it is also using a principled shader. So what we need to do is set the specular down to 0 so it doesn't catch any reflections from HDRIs or lights in our scene. And as you can see, it is in fact pure black. We'll set the metallic value to 0.75. And one thing to note is that generally you want to keep the metallic value to either 1 or 0 because in the real world, objects are either metallic or they're not. But we're not in the real world, are we? So we can set this to whatever we want. We'll also go down to the roughness and just increase it a bit so it's not as reflective. And we'll add this same material to the cross. So select that cross, drop this down, set it to black 001 because we already have a black material on the original scene. You can rename this to black tut. Select the silver, we'll do silver tut. And we'll do the same thing on this object as well. As for this one, you can see it's a silver material. So we'll select the silver tut. Now we'll do the letters and the white parts. So we'll select one of these letters and we'll choose one of these pre-existing materials. We'll do white tut, use nodes, make sure it's set to white. We'll do 0.5 metallic, a roughness of 0.3, and increase the clear coat to 1. The clear coat value kind of mimics car paint, so it kind of adds another layer of reflectivity. But don't take my word for it, please look online to see exactly what the clear coat does. By the way, we can actually add this material to all the other objects that we need to add it to in a very quick way, and we can do that by selecting the object that we want to have the same material applied, so the 2 letters here, and also this one, and then select the B letter last, and then hit Ctrl L for linking and just link materials. And now all of these letters are using the same material. Now finally, let's take care of the blue object and we'll apply this pre-existing material. We'll name this to blue tut, use nodes. Now the first thing to do is to change the color. So I'll copy the hex code I have on the side, paste it there. And by the way, here's another very fun tool, which is called Power Toys. It's a program that has a bunch of features inside of the program. And one of them is this color picker feature. You can see the activation shortcut is Windows key Shift C. So if we hit Windows key Shift C, it'll bring up this tool, which allows us to pick any color on the screen. And then it'll pop up this window with all the color codes and stuff. So you can then copy it and go over to Blender and change the hex code. Alright, so once we're done with applying materials, we can go back and maybe make adjustments to these objects. Just keep in mind that everything I'm doing here is a matter of personal preference, and you can tweak it to whatever you want it to look like. Now let's create a new camera and then start beautifying our scene with some lights. Now we'll find a view or angle that we like. Then we'll hit Shift A to add a new camera to our scene. And with the camera selected, hit Ctrl Alt 0. And that will adjust the camera view to match with the view that we had. We can also hit N to bring up this toolbar on the right side, switch over to the view and check lock camera to view, which means that we can now orbit around the scene, dolly in and out, zoom out, pan around, whatever you want, and the camera is gonna be locked to our view. And then go over to the camera icon here, which brings us over to the camera properties. And if we scroll back up, we can set this to a very high focal length, so like 200 millimeters, maybe even 250, and just dolly out like so. Now we can hit N, make sure this is unchecked because sometimes you tend to forget that the camera is locked to the view and you accidentally orbit around and mess up the angle. Now by using this as reference, we can start setting up the lighting that best suits this angle. So we'll hit Shift A, go over to Light, Area Light. This will be our key light, so we'll rename that to key light. Then we'll bring it up. Then we'll go over to the top view and just hit R twice to rotate it. And we're just gonna rotate it and make it face over here. You can actually click and drag the point of interest here and just make sure it sits on the logo. But we can bring it up a bit, like so, and then just point it there. And of course, in order to see what the light is doing, we need to bring the power up quite a lot. Keep in mind that this highly depends on the scene scale or the object scale. So if we select this, hit N to bring up the toolbar one more time and go over to item, you can see the dimensions over here. These values highly influence how much light you're gonna need to light this object. Now, if we zoom in here, it is a bit sharp, the shadow I mean, so we can set the size of the light to something like 10. Maybe that's a bit too much, maybe 5. And you can do the same thing here. If you hover over, you can get these corners. You can click and drag that. And you can also right click, adjust area light size, go over to the right with the mouse or to the left to do the same thing. Almost always you're gonna have different ways of doing the same thing. Now we can go over to the top view and let's say Shift D, duplicate this, and then we'll bring it on this other side and make sure it's pointing over there. And then change the color of this to the color of the logo. In fact, we can make this a bit more intense. We can increase the intensity a bit so it's more noticeable. And also with the light selected, we can set this to accent light. Now this light isn't doing much, so we can't really see the blue. I mean, we can a bit on this letter, maybe over here a bit as well. And we could increase the intensity. But another thing we could do is maybe move this a bit closer. So we'll hit G to bring up the grab tool or the move tool. Then we'll hit Z once to move it on the global axis. And then Z one more time, so ZZ to switch to local axes and just move it closer like that. But of course we need to bring down the intensity now. Also, you may notice that the outer outline here is a bit too bright. And one thing we could do is maybe make another window here and switch over to the shader editor. And right now we're in the object materials, but we can click this and go over to the world materials, hide the toolbar there. And if we zoom in, we can see the image that we imported earlier. And we can actually change the orientation of this image. To do that, we're gonna use Ctrl T as a shortcut. But remember, you need to turn on the add-on Node Wrangler, which I showed you at the beginning. So I'll go over to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and just type in Node Wrangler and make sure that is enabled. And that will allow you to use the Ctrl T shortcut to add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. Now we can adjust one of these values to rotate the environment. And we'll do 180 on the X. So it kind of rotates the entire HDRI by 180 degrees. And you can see now the bottom part here is much darker. Again, you can go over to the render properties down here under the film, uncheck the transparent, and then you can use that as reference to know how to orient your HDRI. Anyway, we'll Ctrl Z to go back and re-hide that. And let's also bring down the max samples on the viewport here to 100 so it doesn't take as long to render and slows down our computer. Now let's go ahead and create a ground object so we can have this logo lay on top of it. We'll hit Shift A to add a mesh and we'll do cube. Then we can hit Tab to go into edit mode, which allows us to edit any vertices. We can also go into edge mode to edit edges and also face mode to edit faces. You can also use shortcuts 1, 2, 3 to switch between those 3 modes. And now we'll hit A to select all vertices, hit S, Z to scale it on the Z axis, so we'll shrink it down a bit. Then we'll hit S one more time, but also hit Shift Z to scale it on all axes except the Z axis. And we'll just scale this up a lot so we don't see where the ground ends. And then hit Tab to go out of edit mode. Now in the original version, what I did was to cut a hole on the ground that matches the contours of the logo and have the logo sort of fit into the hole. And I'll show you how we can do that by using the Boolean modifier. But first of all, we need to create the shape that's gonna cut a hole into our ground. And you guessed it, the best shape that resembles the logo that we have is a cylinder. And whenever you add a new object, you're gonna have this menu pop up that allows you to set whatever settings you want. And for this cylinder, we'll do 64 vertices, so it's a really smooth cylinder. Then for the radius, we can go over to the top view and switch on X-ray mode so we can see through all of our objects. And then we can decrease the radius by holding down Shift, so it's a really fine tune. And zoom in here and just see how much we need this hole to be. We could even maybe bring this up to 100, so it's a very smooth hole. And in fact, we can actually hide the ground here just so we can see that the logo is not indeed clipping through the cylinder. And if we just hit S, scale it down, you can see how that's gonna clip through, and we don't want that. Now we could hop onto edit mode because we lost the controls that we had, and just make sure we scale this down a bit because we don't need the hole to be as deep. Sorry about that. My mind wanders sometimes. Anyway, we'll make the hole as large as it needs to be. Tab out of edit mode, toggle the X-ray, and then bring back the cube, which will be our ground. And now we can go over to the modifier tab, add the modifier Boolean, and just pick the cylinder. And in fact, we'll do ground hole. Now we can hide the ground hole, and you can see that nothing is happening yet, and that's because the ground is a bit too high up. So we can go over to the side view, toggle X-ray mode, and just bring this down. And we want to match the height of the logo to the height of the ground. So we hit G, Z to bring it down on the Z axis, and then select the ground hole and just make sure we push this up a bit. Now we can hide the ground hole so we don't see it. In fact, we'll use the outer outline as reference for the height of the ground. And you could also apply the modifier here by either clicking the arrow and hitting apply, or use the Ctrl-A shortcut as your mouse is hovering over the Boolean modifier. But we're not going to do that, so hit Ctrl-Z so that we can go back to this at any point in time and make changes if we wanted to. Anyway, we'll select the ground hole, and the way we can make changes to the position of it without actually seeing it is by selecting it and going over to the object properties, and over here on the Z location we can bring this down and just make sure it's as deep as it needs to be. So you can see this outline, you can barely make it up. In fact, we can go over to wireframe mode, which makes it a bit easier to see. And if we select the outer outline and bring this up, there you can see our hole. Now we do need to apply a different material to our ground, so we'll go back into the shader editor, and with it selected, we'll actually apply the same black tut material. It is looking a bit flat around the edges here. There's no like light catch or anything, and that's again because of the fact that it's a pure 100% sharp edge. So what we can do is add a bevel modifier and just decrease the amount, maybe increase the segments, and also right click shade smooth. Now, one quick thing to keep in mind is that when you shade this smooth, sometimes it causes artifacts with the objects, so just make sure you set the normals to auto smooth, and that will take care of any potential issues. But you also want to keep in mind that this bevel is going to make the hole bigger. So with the outline selected, we can hit Alt-G to reset the position, so that brings it back inside of the hole. And as you can see, the hole is a bit larger. So we can go back to the ground hole object under the object properties, and you can click and drag on all three of these values to change them all at once, and we'll do something like 0.98. So it's not much bigger than the logo contours. Now we can select the outer outline, bring it up. We can see the bevel, catch the light there. But if we Ctrl-Z, you can see that the logo fits perfectly in there. Now let's do some house cleaning, and then we'll move on to the animation and rendering. So on the BMW SVG.svg collection here, we'll rename that to BMW. Then we'll select the ground and the ground hole. We'll hit M to make a new collection with our selection, and we'll do ground. Then we'll select our camera and lights and make a collection out of those. So we'll do camera and lights, hit OK, and drop it down. It's always a good idea to rename your objects and organize them in collections. And by the way, just a quick tip, if you hover over the viewport here and hit 1, it'll hide every collection besides the number 1 collection. Then we can hit 2, we can hit 3, and the numbers correspond to the ordering of the collections on your layer stack. So seeing as the first collection on the stack is BMW, if we hit 1, it's gonna isolate only that collection and hide everything else. And now we'll start animating. We'll hit Shift-A to add a new empty. We'll do plain axes, so it just adds an empty object into our scene. Think of this as a null object in After Effects. It's not gonna be visible to our camera or our renders. It's just there to help us out. We can select it though and go over to this icon and just tweak the display size so we can increase that a little bit if we want to. And now we want to parent all of these logo elements to this empty object. And we'll drop down the outer outline, hold down Shift, select all of those, and then hit Alt-P to clear the parent while also keeping the transformation so the positioning doesn't change. Then we'll rename this to Animation Control, and we'll select all of these objects, and then with all of them selected, you can click and drag them onto the animation control while holding down Shift. You can see it says over there at the notification, Shift to parent, and drop it in there, and now all of those objects are parented to the empty, and now if we move the empty, everything moves with it. So we'll hit N, and we can see that the empty location Z is at 0, and we'll go over to say frame 100, and say right click, insert single keyframe, which will add a keyframe only to the Z axis. Then we can go back to frame 0 and bring this all the way up. And in fact, you can hold down Control to snap it by 1 meters. And we can go over to say 3 meters and then right click, insert single keyframe, and that will animate from this point to that point. Now I do want to tweak the easing of this. And the way we can do that is by going over to the graph editor. So click on this icon, switch over to the graph editor, or with your mouse cursor hovering over here, you can hit Control Tab to switch between the timeline and the graph editor. So that's a very neat shortcut. And if you've ever worked with keyframes and easing in After Effects, then this should be very familiar to you. So we can maybe select this keyframe, select this handle here, hit G to move it. And then you can see it's moving in the X and Y direction. So you can hit X to snap it horizontally. Or you can hit the middle mouse button, so press it down, and that will also snap it either vertically or horizontally. And we'll just move this over a bit. And then with this one selected, we'll just move this over here. So it starts moving immediately, but then as it reaches the end point, it's gonna slowly fit into place. And by the way, as we're animating, we can switch to the material preview mode, so it's a bit faster to render. It is a bit slow, so we can maybe move it over. And by the way, I forgot, we can go over to the output properties, and under format, we can set the frames per second and the resolution. We'll do 30 frames per second, and we'll leave it at 1080p. So at 30 frames per second, 300 frames is 10 seconds long. And we can switch over to the timeline by control tabbing again and set this endpoint to 300. Then back to the graph editor. We can also grab the Z rotation and have it rotate from, say, 180 degrees. Right click, insert single keyframe, and then go over here and we'll do 0 and right click, insert single keyframe. And over here on the keyframes, we can hide the Z location so we can only focus on the rotation. And we'll move it over a bit so it's still rotating even after it settles inside the hole. And we'll bring this over to the first frame, and we'll also do that. And we'll even ease this even more. And as we're animating this, we're always focusing on how it looks like on this angle, because this is what we're gonna be rendering. Oh, and one more thing that would be helpful is to go over to the camera, so we'll select it. And under viewport display, you can see this passport 2, if that's how you pronounce it. We can increase that to 1, and this basically overlays a black color on the outside, which helps us focus on what the camera is actually seeing. And in fact, you can see that the camera is actually angled a bit too low, so there's more room at the bottom than there is at the top. So with the camera selected, we can hit R to rotate it, then hit X to rotate it globally, and then hit X one more time to rotate it on the local X axis. We can also hold down Shift to really fine tune the rotation, and then left click to confirm. Now we can also animate the tilt of the camera. So we'll hit N, bring up the rotation values, and we'll right click and insert keyframes, which will add a keyframe for the X, Y, and Z axes. Then we'll go back a bit, and again, we'll hit R, X, X twice, and we'll move it up. Left click to confirm. And what I'm looking for is if we hide the BMW collection, I just want the hole to not be visible at the start. So we're gonna have to rotate that even more. And then right click, insert keyframes. And in fact, I'm thinking we don't need the Y and Z rotation. So we'll select the Y rotation, X to delete, and Z rotation, X to delete. Then we'll select this keyframe, just bring the easing right there so it starts immediately. Move this over and move this over. And we can now re-enable the BMW logo to see how that fits together. And we want this to come in even earlier. And in fact, we're gonna have to push the BMW logo even higher so we don't see it at the beginning. So we'll zoom in here, make sure we select the empty object, and then we can hide the rotation and bring up the location. We'll select the first keyframe, hit G and Y to move it up on the graph editor right until we can't see it in the camera view. And now we start with this sort of empty scene and then play, and we have the logo revealing itself. In fact, we could even move it even higher. So something like that. Now, I hope you don't mind me moving a bit faster here because we did cover most of the things that we need to do in the animation or graph editor. But also keep in mind that you can animate this however you want. So take the time, experiment with the animation, see what works best for you. We could also bring the rotation a bit closer so it doesn't rotate for so long after it settles in. Now we can start animating the objects individually. So we'll select the BMW letters. We'll also select these inner parts here. And we'll hit G to move just so we know we selected everything. You can see we missed these ones. And now we can hit I to insert a location keyframe at this point in time. Then we can move back a bit and then just bring them up like so. And then hit I one more time to insert available keyframes. So that's only gonna add keyframes to whatever we have enabled. In this case, the location. And you can see here that the X and Y haven't been adjusted, so we can click and drag those and just delete those keyframes so we have a more clean timeline. All right, now let's move forward in time to about this point, and we'll start selecting a few objects here and start offsetting the timing. We'll select all three of these letters, then we'll select the keyframes down here, hit S and X to scale them up horizontally. So we increase the length of the animation. And now we'll focus on the camera view here and see how these are coming in. So maybe at this point we want the letters to already show up. And we could even select the M and W, select the keyframes there, and just focus on this part of the timeline. Hit GX. You can see it says by how much we're pushing them over. So we'll do 10 frames. Then with only the W selected, we'll move them over by 10 more frames. Now they're all offset by 10 frames from each other. Now let's also select the inner parts and select all the keyframes. We'll scale them up so they take a bit longer to animate in. Now we'll go over to the animation control and deselect whatever object we don't need. So in this case, the inner outline silver, that's this object. And now we can offset the other one. So we'll do GX by 5 frames. Again, I'm keeping an eye out on this corner here. Then we'll deselect the inner outline black, which is this red circle. And again, we'll do 5 frames. And then we'll only select the cross and move them over by 5 frames. And in fact, we'll select the last keyframe of the cross and have it even further like so. And we'll ease it even more. So it takes a bit longer to settle in. Again, you can play around with the timing of these. Now we could also select the inner blue parts and even offset those. And we'll even select all of these ones. We'll deselect the animation control. And we'll just bring all of the keyframes a bit over so they happen a bit sooner. I want the letters to already come in at this point. And then this one and this one can come in a bit sooner like that. We just want to give this some more variation so the animation feels as dynamic as possible. Let's also go back one more time. We'll select the empty object here and make sure we hide the location, and we'll just rotate it at the start even more. So when the letter B comes in, I want it to be sort of more on this side. We could also scroll down, select the camera, and then down here it says depth of field. We can turn that on and then adjust the distance to determine where the focus plane is. And by the way, we can even drop down the f-stop to something like 0.1. So we have a very shallow depth of field, and then just increase the distance until we find that focus point. Maybe that's a bit too much though, so we'll do 0.5 or 0.3 actually. Oh, and one more thing is that we can actually pick a focus object. So if we pick whip this and let's say set it to the W letter, it's gonna keep the focus at the W letter at all times. And you may be thinking, but at which point though? Because the W letter is not just a single point. And for demonstration purposes, we can clear that and we can actually choose, let's say, this inner outline silver because it is a bigger object. So now, is the focus gonna be at this side of the ring or at that side of the ring? Well, it's gonna take into account the origin point. So if we select it, you can see that's where the origin point is. That's gonna be the point of focus. But anyway, we'll clear the focus object and only use this value. Remember, we can also keyframe this. So let's go at the beginning here, decrease this down so the focus is at the B letter. We'll click this icon to enable the stopwatch for it. Then we'll move forward, let's say 200 frames, and we'll bring this back up and we'll set another keyframe. And then we can also play around with the easing of these. On the original version, what I did was to have another camera at a top-down view and cut to it at a certain point in time. So let's go ahead and select the camera and we'll hit Shift D to duplicate. Then we'll hit A with our cursor over the timeline or the graph editor, hit X to delete all the keyframes, and we'll also hit Alt R to reset the rotation and Alt G to reset the location. We can then move it back up a bit. And in order to see what that camera is seeing, we need to go to the scene properties and switch over to, let's camera point 001. And for this, we'll just go over to the settings, we'll disable the depth of field, and we'll also tweak the focal length so it's not as zoomed in. Maybe even push it up a bit. And now we'll animate this to dolly out. So we'll hit N, bring up the transform, right click on the Z, insert single keyframe. Then we'll go back a bit and move it down, something like that. Insert single keyframe, and we'll move it up even more like so. Replace single keyframe. And we'll actually select both of these keyframes, hit T, and then we can change the interpolation. So we'll set them both to linear, and this way they constantly dolly out. Now let's rename this to camera 2 tut and camera 1 tut. So in the scene properties, it's a bit more obvious. And we'll go back to camera 1 tut, and we'll hit Control Tab to go back to the timeline. And with the mouse cursor hovering over here, we'll hit M to set a marker at that point in time. Then with the second camera selected, we can go over to Marker, Bind Camera to Markers. And this will bind that camera to this marker. So at this point in time, it's gonna cut to the second camera. Now we also wanna go over to frame 0 hit M to make a marker there, select the camera 1, and either hit marker, bind camera to markers, or use Control B as a shortcut, and that cuts to camera 1. And you can see now we're on camera 1 up until we hit frame 150. And at that point, we switch to camera 2. So that's a pretty nifty way of switching between two different cameras. Now, I'm not quite liking the way this camera is tilting downwards and then stopping immediately. So we'll hit Control Tab, go back to the graph editor. And with it selected, we'll go over to the rotation and we'll just drag this over a bit so it constantly rotates. Tweak the easing. So you can see it's constantly rotating or tilting downwards and following the motion of these objects. And then on our second camera, we can select that and just make sure that this movement starts at roughly at that point and goes all the way over the frame 300. And I also want the rotation to slightly carry on over to the second camera view. So we'll go back up, select the animation control, and just bring this rotation value a bit over. So you can see as soon as we cut to this, it's also rotating a bit. Alright, so we're pretty much done with the animation. We can now go back to the render mode. We'll go over to the shader editor at the bottom. And with the ground selected, we'll maybe make a duplicate of this and we'll call this ground. By the way, you can click this icon, it just duplicates that same material. We'll increase the metallicness a bit. And by the way, you can hold down Alt and use the scroll wheel to scrub through the animation like so. Keep scrolling through until we cut to the second camera. And we'll go down, turn the original reference image back on and just make sure it's a bit on top here. And we'll delete the principled shader and we'll just plug the color directly into the surface so it doesn't get affected by any lighting or anything like that. And you can see that in the original logo design, there's this sort of gradient at the top left of the logo. And we can actually replicate that by adding a point light. So we'll do Shift A, light, we'll do point light. We'll bring this up a bit and then we'll hit right click, adjust light radius so it's a bit wider. We could also go back to the timeline, and if we move back, see how the first camera angle is looking. With the light and without the light, we might not want this light to be present on the first shot. So we'll go over to frame 151, or frame 150 rather. We'll set a keyframe there for the power, then we'll move backwards by one frame by hitting the left arrow key, and we'll set this down to 0 and set a keyframe. This way, the light is off up until this point, and then from the frame 150 onwards, it's turned on. All right, so let's rehide the reference image and also make sure we turn it off on the render so it's not gonna show up on our renders. And now let's finally render this out. So we'll go to the render properties. Under viewport, these are the settings that are used inside of the viewport display. But for rendering, these are the ones we need to change. So we'll set the max samples to something like 256. Remember, we have to keep in mind render time, so we don't need high samples, especially in this scene. But instead, we're gonna use the denoiser that comes with Blender. Then we'll go down even further until we see the color management tab, and we'll make sure we're on the filmic mode. And then for the look, we'll set this to something like high contrast. If you want more control, you can actually set this back to none and then use curves down here, which you might be familiar with if you've used the curves effect in After Effects or Photoshop or whatever. You can just dial in the contrast with this one. But let's Control Z and undo, and we'll keep it simple and set the look to high contrast. We can also go back in time just to see how that looks like on the first shot. I'm thinking the outline here is a bit overblown. Let's quickly go back to the shader editor and we'll select the outline, which is the silver. And we'll also select the ground because now you see how this cross is blending with the ground. So we can maybe increase that. And now let's go back to the output properties. We'll set the file format to PNG with 0 compression. We can set the destination as well. So we'll go back here. We'll do new folder, render tut. Double click on that, hit accept. And before we render out our animation, it's always good practice to render a still image at say this point in time. So we'll go render image or use F12 as a shortcut. And as you can see, the cylinder that we use to cut a hole on the ground is visible in the render view. So we're gonna close that and we'll find the ground collection and just make sure the ground hole is unchecked for the rendering. Now we'll go back to render image and you can see that now it's no longer visible. So we'll close that. And whenever you're ready, you just go render animation, and you're good to go. All right, guys, so we're pretty much done with all the steps, I think. I hope I didn't forget anything. With that said, let's move on to the outro of this tutorial. Alright guys, we've finally reached the end of the tutorial, so if you're still watching, then thanks for being patient all the way through. If you happen to create something by following this tutorial and post it on social media platforms, then make sure to tag me because I always enjoy seeing what you guys come up with. Remember to download the project files on my Gumroad page, which again are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free while still having the option to support the channel if you'd like to. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell to be notified. Share this video with any of your friends to share the knowledge, because sharing is caring. And with that said, thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.